2013, a colloquium on the study of unidentified aerial phenomena, UFOs, was organized featuring prominent NASA scientists, aviation professionals, military officers, and tenured professors to examine the safety of our skies. The footage mysteriously went missing. In 2023, one partially damaged drive was found. This is the recovered footage.
All right, let me get set up here. Well, thank you all for coming, and a special thanks to Kent Center, whose generosity made all this possible, and also to Leslie Kane, who did a lot of the organizing and has also been a terrific supporter of mine ever since I got into this issue. So thank you both. It's a real privilege to be here. My talk today is in 3 unequal parts. The first, which is about half the talk, I'm going to set up a puzzle, what I call the puzzle of the UFO taboo. The second part, I'll propose a solution or explanation of the puzzle. And then the third, most briefly, I'll make a new, what I think is radical suggestion for what might be done about it. And I should also say up front that as a political scientist, unlike everybody else on the program, I have no particular expertise in UFO phenomena. And especially in this crowd, I suspect that most of what I'm going to say is relatively familiar, at least until toward the end. However, I've written my talk with our larger audience in mind, namely people who are not yet convinced that the UFO phenomenon is serious, but who might watch the DVD. So the puzzle. My puzzle is, why don't the authorities take UFOs seriously? Given that if any UFOs were discovered to be extraterrestrials, ETs, it would be one of the most important events in human history. Now note that my question here is not, what are UFOs? I have no idea what UFOs are, except that they are unidentified. Rather, my question is, why don't the authorities care to find out what UFOs are, given the ET possibility, no matter how remote that is? Now, not everyone, in fact, perhaps most people in the mainstream would not agree that this is a puzzle. And so what I want to do now is defend the claim that there is a puzzle here against what I think are the 3 main objections to the idea. The first objection to the idea that there's a puzzle is that some might say that the authorities have taken UFOs seriously and concluded that they were of no interest. And indeed, as we've heard today, a few governments have recently cautiously dipped their toes into the UFO water, like Chile, and in the case of the French, there's been official interest for several decades now. Nonetheless, I think the claim of official neglect of UFOs is very strong. 3 points of quick evidence. First, the vast majority of governments, including the United States, have never invested any resources in serious scientific studies of UFOs, and instead treated the phenomenon as a public relations problem rather than a scientific one. And those few governments that have spent money on UFO research have done so in very small amounts, and then they have not gone out to look for UFOs, but rather only analyzed cases that came in over the transom. That's important, but that's a far cry from systematic surveillance of the skies to actually find UFOs if they're out there, which I think is what's really needed. So as a result, only a tiny percentage of all the UFO reports since 1947 have ever been investigated, although it's worth noting that some percentage of those, maybe 5 to 25%, did not appear to have conventional explanations. Secondly, not only governments, but the scientific community too is hostile to UFO research, such that it would be impossible, I think, to get a grant from the National Science Foundation to study them. Indeed, even SETI, which has spent probably billions of dollars looking for ETs around distant stars, for which there is no evidence whatsoever, refuses to extend their search into our own backyard. And third, finally, the mainstream media, on both left and right, this is very much a bipartisan issue, reinforces this negative attitude, only rarely reporting UFO sightings, and when they do, it's with a wink and a smile, just to remind their audience that they don't really take UFOs seriously either. In short, I think the case for official neglect of UFOs is overwhelming. Moreover, it goes beyond simple neglect. It goes to what I call a taboo on the entire subject, so that even if you wanted to study UFOs seriously in a scientific way, no one would care and they would laugh behind your back. So I think the first objection to the puzzle just doesn't cut any ice at all. The second objection is one that accepts the claim of official neglect, but argues that there is an obvious reason for the neglect, which is that UFOs don't exist, and so why study them? A skeptical political science colleague of mine once said to me, "People used to believe in witches. Does that mean that witches are real too?" But this objection rests on a simple and fundamental mistake, namely that UFO means ET, which misses the point entirely. The puzzle is not about ETs, it's about UFOs, which are not the same thing. Some UFOs might be ETs, or maybe none of them are. So the question is, do UFOs exist? To answer that, let's briefly look at the evidence. Since 1947, there have been over 100,000 UFO reports. Most of these, admittedly, are just eyewitness accounts, which skeptics might be able to dismiss as hoaxes or uninformed people seeing witches in the sky. On the other hand, many of these eyewitness reports are from, and we've heard some of this today, are from what might be called expert witnesses: fighter pilots, airline pilots, air traffic controllers, astronauts, and so on. People who've spent a lot of time watching the sky and who have no professional incentive to come forward with their reports, given the taboo on the subject. Now, maybe even these experts are just seeing witches. But in my view, if an F-16 pilot reports something he can't explain, who am I, or you, sitting in our living rooms, to second-guess such a professional by saying he saw a witch? Still, I agree that eyewitness testimony by itself cannot establish the reality of the UFO phenomenon. That's why the physical evidence is crucial. By now, there are probably several thousand videos, photographs, and most convincingly, I think, radar tracks of apparent objects going thousands of miles an hour, making 90-degree turns, and all the rest. Of course, these days, it's very easy to doctor videos on Photoshop and so on, but it was much harder in the past, and that doesn't mean that real anomalies are not still happening today. So when I say UFOs are real, all I am saying is that unidentified physical anomalies, material anomalies, do happen in the skies. I'm making no claim at all about what they might be, whether ETs or not. So I think that takes care of the second objection. The first two objections, I think, are pretty easy to deflect. The third is really the skeptic's real line of defense against the puzzle. Namely, even though UFOs are real, and even though they're unidentified, we know they are not ETs. And since we already know that, there's no puzzle here, and UFOs are not worth studying. In response, my question would be, how do they know that? Well, it's not by having done any science on UFOs, which they have not done, and they actually positively oppose. No, they know that UFOs are not ETs because theory tells them so. In other words, it can't be true that UFOs are ETs, and so therefore it isn't. What I want to do now is challenge this claim to knowledge about UFOs, or what UFOs are not, as if we were in a court of law. The UFO skeptic is the prosecutor trying to prove that UFOs are not ETs, and I'll play defense attorney on behalf of my client, the possibility that UFOs are ETs. Specifically, I'm going to go through the four main arguments that skeptics make for their claim that UFOs cannot be ETs. And I'm going to show that every one of them fails to make the case. In other words, what I want to do is prove our ignorance about what UFOs are, and therefore that all we have is belief and not knowledge. So the first prosecution argument is, we are alone in the universe, and therefore ETs don't exist. This is a question that's been debated for centuries, and in the 20th century, most scientists actually thought that yes, we are alone. This view, I think, was partly driven by the theory of evolution, which suggested that the emergence of life on Earth was an extremely unlikely accident, and thus almost certain not to be repeated elsewhere. And yet lately, the debate has really tipped the other way. Hundreds of so-called exoplanets have been discovered around other stars, with more every day, and in the end, they might number in the millions or even billions. We don't have any clue yet. Moreover, our theory of life has evolved too, such that many scientists today think that life might even be common in the universe rather than extremely rare. Of course, that doesn't mean intelligent life exists elsewhere. It could just be bacteria. But if there are millions of planets out there, then maybe intelligent life is present on some of them. Either way, astrobiology is now a booming research field, And so the scientific establishment clearly thinks that the question of life elsewhere, intelligent or otherwise, is open. In short, nobody really knows whether we are alone or not, which means that ETs could be out there. The second prosecution argument is they can't get here. Namely, given the huge distances between the stars and the speed of light barrier, even if ETs do exist, there's no way they can get to Earth. In my view, this is the strongest argument in the skeptic's case, but it is by no means decisive. First, computer simulations have been done for decades, showing that given the age of the universe, if there are any ETs out there, even at sublight speeds, they should have gotten here a long time ago. Moreover, and second, at least theoretically speaking, it's beginning to look as if it might be possible, after all, to travel faster than the speed of light. The idea being that if you can bend gravity around a spaceship or find a wormhole to travel through, then you could actually, in a sense, transcend the light speed barrier. Now, it's still very unclear whether such warp drive is possible, even in theory, and even if it's possible in theory, it may be impossible in practice. We just don't know. However, the US government thinks enough of the possibility that they fund research on it, so we'll see. But the key point here is that if human beings are already imagining such technologies just 400 years after our scientific revolution, what kind of technology might ETs have 4,000 years or 4 million years after their scientific revolution? After all, just 150 years ago, every human scientist on the planet would have told you that airplanes were impossible, much less going to the moon. So are we so much smarter today that we know that ETs cannot get here? I just don't think so. The third argument the skeptic would make is that they would land on the White House lawn. The argument here is that if ETs can get here, and if they came all this way to see us, why don't they introduce themselves? And since they haven't, this is evidence that they are not here. However, this argument depends on assumptions about ET intentions that have no scientific basis. It all depends on their purposes. Perhaps they are here to farm our DNA. Or maybe they've set aside Earth as a wildlife preserve or a zoo. Or perhaps they think we're too violent to contact. Or perhaps they have a non-interference doctrine like the Federation on Star Trek. Or maybe they're just waiting for us to figure out that they're here before they're willing to talk to us. In other words, there are lots of reasons why they would not necessarily land on the White House lawn, which is to say, no one really knows what their intentions would be. The fourth argument, the last one, is we would know. This is an appeal to human authority, namely that with all our surveillance technology these days, especially looking at the skies, we would know if ETs are here. Now, conspiracy theorists, of course, think we do know, but the government just isn't telling. Personally, I don't think that's very likely. I think if the government is hiding anything about UFOs, it's hiding its ignorance. But either way, I don't think it is obvious that we would know if they were here. UFOs are very elusive, basically random and unpredictable, and on top of that, human beings have never really looked for them in a systematic way. And even if UFOs do sometimes show up on our surveillance systems, often those systems are not programmed to record what they're seeing. So I don't see this argument as convincing either. In sum, the prosecution has not proven its case that no UFOs are ETs. Indeed, personally, I don't think it has come close. To be clear, I'm not saying that the prosecution's arguments are wrong. They might actually be right. We may very well be alone in the universe. What I'm saying is that there is reasonable doubt, that there are good arguments on both sides, and so reasonable people can disagree. What that means, in other words, is that human beings really have no idea what UFOs are, whether ETs or not. We are simply ignorant. And given that ignorance, the only rational view to have about ETs circling our skies is one of agnosticism, neither affirming their existence nor denying it. This brings me back to my puzzle of why the authorities don't take UFOs seriously. Never mind the whole bit about possibly discovering the most important event in human history. What about simple scientific curiosity? Human beings are very curious creatures, and the whole enterprise of science is dedicated to satisfying that curiosity, even about the most trivial things. And yet here, in the face of the UFO, official and scientific curiosity stops. Why? I think it's a huge puzzle and one that's just too important to leave alone. As you'll see when I get to the last part of my talk, it doesn't really matter why the establishment does not take UFOs seriously. What matters is that they don't, and are unlikely to change their minds anytime soon. However, it was trying to solve this puzzle, to explain the UFO taboo, that as a political scientist I first got into this field. So let me say a few words about what I personally think is going on here. My argument is not a conspiracy theory, which I think gives governments too much agency, as if human beings were somehow in control of this issue. Instead, I'm going to make what political scientists call a structural argument, namely that the structure of the modern state is such that it cannot put the UFO question on the table even if it wanted to. And by the state here, I don't mean the government or the people we elect every 4 years. What I mean is the constitutional order that underlies the government and on which our entire society is based. Specifically, I'm going to argue that the UFO poses what I call a triple threat to the modern state. The first and most obvious threat is a physical one, namely that if UFOs are ETs, then their technology is obviously vastly superior to our own, which raises the possibility of colonization or even extermination, the Independence Day scenario. And that's threatening to the modern state because it gets its legitimacy from its claim that it is the sole entity that can protect us from enemies and danger. The state cannot protect us from ETs, and so since UFOs have not demonstrated any hostility, from the state's point of view, it's better to just let sleeping dogs lie, because they would have no adequate response. The second threat is what I call an identity threat. The argument here is that if UFOs were thought to be ETs, there would be intense political pressure for a unified human response through the UN, in effect for a world government. And that's threatening to states because their identity as states and ours as citizens depends on keeping their sovereignty separate into 200 separate sovereign countries. So the idea of this second identity threat is that states don't want to open up the UFO question because it could potentially result in having to merge their identities into one identity, into one state, namely humanity as a whole. And that would undermine their existence as the United States or as Canada and so on. Still, these first two threats, I think, don't really go to the heart of the matter. I think the real issue here is the third, the deepest threat to the modern state, which I call a metaphysical threat. The essence of the modern state, or of modern sovereignty, is anthropocentric. Anthropocentrism is the view that man is the center of the universe. Politically, for the state, what that means is that for the first time in history, in modern times, it is assumed in all states that human beings are completely and solely in charge of what happens, that we decide our own fate, that we are sovereign. And that was not true historically in ancient times or medieval times, when it was believed that the gods, or God, or nature had ultimate sovereignty over man. Part of what makes us modern is the belief that we no longer believe that the gods or nature or God have sovereignty over us, at least when it comes to organizing our political life. The UFO calls this anthropocentric assumption into question, and therefore threatens the whole basis of modern state power. If UFOs were found to be ETs, it would be almost like a materialization of God, like the second coming. And if God, i.e. in this case the ETs, materialize, who would people give their loyalty to? Who would you give your loyalty to? I don't know, but the threat here is that there is a higher power than the state. Not one trying to conquer us, but one that shows that we are not completely in charge of the planet or even of our own lives, that we are not sovereign over ourselves. And that, I think, would be deeply destabilizing to everything that the modern state and modern society stands for and is based on, something that could cause the state to implode. In sum, taking these three threats together, the reason there is a taboo on studying UFOs is that the state is afraid of the UFO, not consciously, but subconsciously, because it calls everything about our world into question. The UFO, in other words, is first and foremost a political problem before it is a scientific one. The last part of the talk I've entitled, What is to be Done? My argument above might suggest that when it comes to the UFO taboo, resistance is futile. And the history of ufology since 1947 might reinforce that conclusion, since it has utterly failed to break the taboo. However, my own view is that ufologists have pursued the wrong strategy on the UFO problem by trying to convince the government or the scientific community to take the lead, either by admitting to alien contact through disclosure or by pursuing a full-blown science of UFOs itself. If my argument is right, then neither of these is going to happen anytime soon. Not because the authorities don't want to, but because subconsciously they can't do it. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm very supportive of Leslie's suggestion that the US should establish an agency, modeled on Chile and France's, to look into UFO cases. But that's going to take a long time to pay off. And in the meantime, I think the UFO taboo is actually vulnerable, much more vulnerable today than it has ever been before. But to break the taboo, I think a new two-step strategy is needed. Step one is a commitment to what I call militant agnosticism about UFOs. By agnosticism here, I mean taking no position at all on what UFOs are, and especially the ET question, until science justifies one. So that means rejecting not only the UFO skeptics on the one hand, but also the UFO conspiracy theorists on the other. Because both of them claim to know, the one that they are ETs and the other that they're not ETs. However, by itself, agnosticism is not political. It's personal or private, like being agnostic about God. In order to be politically effective against the taboo, agnosticism must be militant. Now, by that, I don't mean violent. What I mean is being public and strategic. By calling defenders of the taboo out into the open and make them prove that UFOs are not ETs, rather than being able to keep hiding behind snickering and laughter. So that's step one. That's the easy part. Step two is to do precisely what the UFO taboo says we should not do, which is to try to study UFOs systematically in a scientific way to find out what they are. And since the government and scientific community won't do that, that means enlisting the millions of UFOs believers out there to do it themselves in a bottom-up democratic approach to a UFO science, which I believe is very doable today in contrast to the past. Namely, my idea here is to build a civilian-controlled UFO surveillance network using video cameras, magnetometers, spectrographs, and other instruments to monitor the sky 24/7 looking for UFOs. And if they occur, then recording as much scientific data about them as possible right then when they're happening. Two things I think make this very doable today. First, unlike SETI, which needs powerful telescopes costing millions of dollars, the technology required for UFO surveillance is very low end, and much of it can be purchased almost off the shelf. You could probably build a basic surveillance station for under $100,000, which means that in principle you could have hundreds or thousands of these stations all over the world, all networked together through the internet. The other thing that makes this doable today is the internet, from which you could use to raise money in the form of lots of small donations from all those believers out there to fund the research. Could such an approach succeed? I think so, since unlike ufology in the past, which focused on getting governments to do something, this approach basically enables the people to do something, to take direct action themselves on the UFO question rather than waiting for someone else to do it for us. And I think that could be very empowering and might actually bring a lot of people on board. My name is Alex Wendt. I'm a professor of political science at Ohio State University.
Okay, fantastic. And what do you study and or teach that's interesting and relevant, germane to this subject?
Nothing. I teach international politics, and none of my teaching has anything to do with the UFO issue.
Okay, how do you make that connection?
I published an article back in 2008, actually the first article ever in a social science journal about the UFO problem. which tries to argue that it's a political problem before it's a scientific problem. And so there is a connection, but I don't do teaching on that. I just published the one article.
If you were to start teaching about this, you think you'd have some career issues?
I'm a full professor, tenured and everything, so I think, if anything, if I started teaching, I'd probably get a huge enrollment, and my department would be very happy about that. But I don't have any plans to start teaching anytime soon on this.
Okay, great. So I was doing a lot of research on you to try to figure out, what I wanted to talk to you about and everything, and obviously Taboo is really interesting. So the documentary itself is about people and how UFO sightings have affected their lives specifically. And what I mean by that is someone sees a UFO in this country, there's nowhere to call and report.
Yeah.
Not really. There's no mechanism, there's no protocol, and people are ridiculed, humiliated, whatnot, and therefore a culture has been created. So your specific thing was very interesting to me. So can I just start by saying, why are UFOs taboo?
Well, I'm going to talk about that in my talk tomorrow. My own view is that ultimately they're taboo because opening up the question of the UFO raises the issue of that they might be ETs, and that possibility is very threatening to the nature of the modern state, is what I'm going to argue. That the whole way that the modern state is organized is anthropocentric, by which I mean that it all assumes that human beings and human beings alone make all the decisions on this planet. And if that fundamental assumption of the modern state were called into question, I think you would have a lot of political issues. The legitimacy of the government would come into question. It would be a big problem. And so I think the whole issue just needs to be pushed aside because it's threatening. I think the government, in a sense, is scared of the issue, and that's at a subconscious level. So.
Andrew, do you think, so basically you're saying the government is afraid of mass hysteria, mass panic, ultimately rebellion?
Yeah, I guess that would be kind of the extreme form, hysteria, that kind of thing, but I think it's more subconscious than that in the sense that they just don't want to go there. Because where could nothing good can come of it, basically, if you open up that door politically.
Do you believe that there would be mass hysteria, panic?
If the UFO question were put on the table, no. If ETs landed, then that would be, who knows what would happen. That would be obviously, there could be hysteria, yeah.
Right.
But I would separate the ET question from the UFO problem.
Right, I would.
So.
Very good. So let's talk about this taboo itself. Is it a natural social occurrence? Is it something that happens with just certain things, happens naturally, or is it manifested by a culture run by our government or by sub-government or by certain entities within the government? Is it a naturally occurring phenomenon, or was it done on purpose?
In the article, my co-author, who is also a professor of political science, and I are very conscious of steering away from any kind of conspiracy argument. Our view is that it's really at a deeper level than that, and clearly there are people involved. When reports come in, they have to be censored or whatever, so there are people sort of at various levels of the government that are doing things. But I don't believe personally that there's any kind of orchestrated effort. I'm not sure there ever was an orchestrated effort to suppress this issue. I think it's an issue that just was politically impossible to open up. So I would say it's really, in a sense, a naturally occurring phenomenon, what I would call a structural phenomenon. It's not something where somebody's in charge directing a conspiracy to suppress it.
Structural. Can you kind of talk more about that so I understand exactly what you mean by structural?
Well, if our argument is true that the way that modern society is organized is based on humans being in charge and only humans being in charge, sort of what we call anthropocentric, then anything that calls that assumption into question is threatening. And there doesn't have to be anybody in charge to protect that assumption. It's more just that the whole issue cannot be opened up. So it's the way that, I guess by structural, I mean that the structure of the modern system of rule, the modern state, is just based on this fundamental assumption. And I guess to put it in context, in the old days, God was in charge, or nature was in charge. The modern world, since maybe the 1600s or something, man is in charge, and only man. And we're in charge of the animals, and we're in charge of everything on the planet. And that's really a first, historically. And that assumption would be called into question in a fundamental way if we open up the UFO issue.
So it's not only political, it's also religious.
It could be a religious issue as well. We don't explore that in our article, but I think it would have religious implications. Although I remember reading somewhere once that some theologians have discussed this issue or debated it and concluded that it wasn't obvious that this would be threatening to modern religions. Although it's sort of, intuitively you think it would be, but it wouldn't have to be necessarily.
That's great. Now, do you believe that there's a way to change this taboo? Is there a way through politically, culturally, socially?
Yes.
I think there's a way through it.
Yes. I think the way to do it is you have to create science of UFOs and simply collect lots and lots of data. And you need hard scientific data, instrumented data, lots of it, third parties, and triangulated data, everything that you'd want from a science, and then you just show it to people. If you've got that kind of data that's systematic and it's been collected over a long period of time, it seems to me that the issue would get blown wide open. But we've never had that data, and until we do, I don't think anybody's going to listen.
So you think with enough hard evidentiary presentation of actual data, hard science data, overwhelming amount, there would be a governmental disclosure?
Well, I guess I'm hesitant to use the word disclosure. I don't think the government is covering up anything except its own ignorance.
Okay.
So I don't want to sort of go down the disclosure route. I think that if we had hard data, and not just data of individual cases after the fact, I think what's needed is to have constant monitoring of the skies, 24/7 kind of data being created, and then when UFOs occur, you've got all the instruments right there looking at them, recording whatever there is to be recorded, and if you get a bunch of cases like that, hundreds, maybe thousands, then that would create a lot of pressure, I think, on the scientific community, perhaps on governments. I have very little faith that the government would ever take this issue up. Although, as we'll see tomorrow, some governments are. It's just not the United States and other major powers.
Right. That's interesting. Does this taboo, this reluctance to the government, is it right for us to say the taboo is a government taboo or a political taboo? What's a better way to say it?
Well, I think the scientific community is a big part of it.
Okay.
Certainly in the United States.
They're culpable.
They're culpable. I mean, even the SETIans, who have spent billions of dollars looking for aliens for which there's no evidence at all,
Right.
are opposed to looking at our own backyard. So I mean, they're part of the taboo too. I think it is political, though, in the sense that before we ever can have scientific progress, we need to sort of have a political opening in some way. That won't come from the government. I think it has to come basically from the people rather than from governments.
Is this harmful to our society, the way we approach it? The taboo itself, is it a harmful, socially harmful to us?
I think as a society, in a way, the taboo is protective. It protects the kind of society we have today, a society where human beings are in charge. We don't have to worry about anybody else. We make all the decisions. We call all the shots. I think it's harmful to individuals who may experience UFO phenomena, but as a society, it's really one of the assumptions that holds the whole society together. So in that sense, I would say it's not harmful at all. It's actually essential to maintaining the system we have.
So the illusion is necessary.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Now that's interesting. So based on that, what are the negative consequences of going forward this illusion? Because we know lies only last so long, and any given lie or illusion or falsality at any point going long enough, holes would poke into it and it will crash. So what are the negative consequences of this?
If it crashes, you mean?
Or any negative consequences that you see. I think eventually it has to crash. I mean, probability study would say this eventually is going to crash, but maybe you don't believe that. So.
Well, I'm not sure. I mean, I think, it's been 60-some years since 1947. Nothing has changed really in that time. It's not obvious that President Obama is going to stand up tomorrow and say, we need to look at UFOs. I mean, it's just not going to happen. So I think this could go on for a long time, because if there is any kind of intelligence behind the UFO phenomenon, and that's a big if, but if there is, that intelligence clearly is not interested in contacting us right now. So in that sense, the UFOs themselves aren't going to change anything. It has to come from us, and it's not obvious how that's going to happen. So it may be a while.
So you don't think that there's going to be anything negative that happens to us?
I mean, if it does crash?
Right.
Well, I think, again, separating the ET issue from the UFO issue, I think opening up the UFO question, I think would not be negative. I think it might be quite liberating, actually, especially for people who actually have had experiences. They would feel vindicated. It would be incredibly interesting scientifically if it were legitimated to actually study UFOs. And who knows, we might actually find out something really important. So I guess I don't see a lot of negatives. What would be negative, though, is that we would not be able to sustain the belief anymore that we are totally in charge forever on this planet.
Right. Okay, so let's go back to the modern state and the sovereignty thing. So let's discuss specifically how a verified encounter threatens that. Specifically.
Well, I mean, a verified encounter with ETs.
A verified encounter, right.
Well, I think that would, just the whole thing would collapse. I think if ETs show up, I mean, the state's job is to protect us. The state's legitimacy depends on its claim to be the only authority to be able to protect us physically from threats, whether they're external threats like the Soviets in the Cold War or whatever, or internal threats, terrorists and so on. And clearly ETs, if they got here and revealed themselves, if they exist, would have vastly superior technology to us. The government clearly could not protect us from them. So then you would have a potential for hysteria. It would, I think, call the entire legitimacy of the modern state into question. What would their function be anymore?
Right.
They couldn't do what their main job is.
That's brilliant, man. That's great. So, based on that, I guess, is there any hope? Do you have any hope that the government will change its MO? Will they change the way they do business? Will they continue not paying attention to the subject?
Well, I think there's variation among governments. The French, as always, are different than everybody else, and they're out in front on this issue. Although even in France, the issue is not, I mean, I guess I'm waiting for the talk tomorrow to learn more about this, but I think even in France, the issue is not fully accepted. But there are some governments in the global south, Chile and so on, that have done a bit more. But the scientific community in those countries is not as strong. I think in the United States, you have an alliance, basically, of the government and the scientific community, all of whom have their heads in the sand. So in that sense, I don't think, at least in the major powers, this is going to change anytime soon.
Have you ever witnessed anything that you
No.
thought might be UFO?
No.
Nothing? Never once?
Never.
Me neither.
Yeah. No, I wish I had. But
Yeah. You do?
yeah, I would like to have an experience, but what are the odds? You can't control it, so.
I think we have a couple people that probably can figure out what those odds are here.
Possibly, yeah.
All right, I've just got a couple more questions here for you. This one is, do you believe,
Sorry.
no problem, take your time.
Yeah.
Do you believe that there are craft in our skies, flying in our skies, that are using technology that is not made by human beings?
Do I believe it?
Do you believe it?
Well, I would separate believing and knowing. I have no knowledge. I think it's purely a function of belief, and it's a belief that has no basis in anything. It just it would be a gut instinct. And if you sort of, with all those qualifications, I guess I would say that if ETs exist anywhere, they should be here by now. It would make sense for them to be here by now for lots of reasons. And so then, yes, I think there probably are craft, and I think we're under surveillance.
I think you covered yourself on that answer pretty well.
Okay, right.
I can't poke a hole in it.
No.
I guess you're good. I'll have my lawyers look at it now.
Yeah.
I'm just kidding.
Yeah.
That's great. Okay, last question.
Mhm.
All right. So if you can give me a one-word answer, if you can, I'd like it. Okay.
I'm an academic, though, so it's
Yeah, I
it's
know.
tough,
I've been
but-
hearing that all day.
Yeah.
That's okay, if you can. Do extraterrestrials or aliens from other worlds, intelligent life in other worlds, exist?
Were you asking my belief, or? Yeah, I would say yes. Yeah, yeah. Why not? I think it would be, again, in a way, to say that it's not, to say that they don't exist is, again, another manifestation of anthropocentrism. It's to say that we're the center of the universe. And that's just ridiculous, I think.